It is the year 9. A large Roman force rushes north to put down a rebellion. Little did they know the rebellion was not as it seems, and was in fact a pretense to lure them into a trap. Soon they would be fighting for their lives instead. This is a collaboration between myself and the Ancient History Guy. His video covers the circumstances leading up to the battle and is extremely informative. He really does the complex topic justice, and his video explains it way better than I ever could. It's linked in the top right now, and I recommend you check it out after watching this video to get some context of the Gauls' deception. Where he left off, Rome had just secured a large swath of land in Spain, turning now to the province of Germany. Rome had conquered the territory in 6 AD and had left many cohorts of legionaries to guard what were supposedly allied tribesmen. At a set time, the tribes all rose up together and slaughtered the garrisoned Romans. They then sent messengers back to the Romans, stating that there had been a revolt in the north. Of course, this was a lie. There was no northern revolt. This didn't stop the Romans from responding, however, and marching through what they thought were allied tribes' land. Meanwhile, the Germans were setting up an ambush. The Roman army moved down a narrow dirt path, which at this point was now mostly mud. Forests surrounded the path, and the terrain was hilly. If this sounds like perfect terrain for an ambush to you, you'd be right. While this is obvious to us, it apparently wasn't obvious to the Roman commander, Publius Quintilius Varus, who failed to scout ahead or, choose not to march his army through a wooded swamp. The point being that he did have options, but was in a rush to put down the supposed rebellion. Marching around the swamp, establishing scouts or pickets to guard the crossing, or just sitting tight until he was sure it was safe, were all great options, but not to someone in a careless rush. So Publius marched his men through this hilly mud swamp, and to the surprise of no one except Publius, was promptly ambushed. Action report. Offense. The average legionary carried a sword and 2 javelins. The Germans carried a mismatch of axes and swords, but made good use of the freme, a thin blade spear that was ideal for punching through armor. Defense. The Romans had the standard lorica squamata, heavy scale armor, and shields. The Gauls had a mismatch of armor ranging from chainmail to nothing. Definite advantage to the Romans. There are 20,000 Gauls versus 25,000 Romans, so advantage again to the Romans. Remember that this trail is pretty narrow, and there are 25,000 Romans. That's a lot of Romans, plus all their baggage and camp followers. This meant that they had to spread out, really far out, 15 kilometers or 9 miles to be exact. Suddenly, a large number of Gauls appeared on the hills surrounding the column and began to rain javelins down on the Romans. They then charged and began fighting. As Roman reinforcements arrive, they melt back into the forest. The vanguard of the Roman column prepares to meet the enemy force, but they never come. Throughout the day, this situation repeats again and again. Suddenly, the weak sections of the spread-out Roman column would come under vicious attack. The attackers then melt back into the forest, and any Roman units dumb enough to follow are ambushed. The Romans are being picked apart, piece by the guerrilla tactics. Finally, Publius orders a chunk of his force to hold the flanks of the path while the vanguard fights its way free and establishes a camp on drier ground on the far side of the swamp. The Romans retire for the night, safe behind their walls. Day 2. Publius was urged to fall back towards Rome. However, he ignored his advisors and made plans to continue towards a Roman fort some 60 miles away, confident if he could only bring the enemy to battle, he could win. Ditching most of their supplies, the Romans slipped out under cover of night and actually evaded the Gauls for a time. They marched all day uneventfully, then encamped in a field. Publius hoped the enemy would come fight them in the open field, but the Germans wisely chose not to. Day 3. Next, the Romans marched as far north as they could before re-entering the forest. Again, the Germans attacked from the forest. This time the Romans were ready, and fighting as a cohesive unit, repulsed each attack, but at a high cost. They, however, couldn't advance, and were forced back into their camp for the night. Day 4. With a fierce storm picking up, the Romans were forced to remain in place. However, the Germans used this time to bring in additional reinforcements. The lighter German infantry had little problem maneuvering in the storm. The heavily armored Roman infantry with their carts and wagons and wounded, not so much. Day 5. Continuing their march, again, the Romans stumbled into yet another ambush. This one would be even more massive than the previous. Advancing close by a swamp, suddenly Germans sprung from the tree line, and with the swamp securing their flank, began to advance towards the Romans. Publius then ordered the construction of yet another fortified encampment. By this point, part of his army had had enough. Some of the cavalry broke off and fled east. They didn't get very far, however, before being run down by Germans. Battle was joined, and the Romans fought desperately to hold the enemy back until the camp was finished. At this time, yet another German force appeared on the hills to the east of the Roman camp and charged. The Romans were busy building the camp and couldn't get into battle formations in time. The fight turned into a slaughter. Publius, seeing the battle was lost, took his own life, and these Germans then wheeled and charged the rear of the bulk of the Roman line. Attacked from the rear, the fight turned into a slaughter, and soon there were only a few hundred Romans standing. They surrendered, but the Gauls were not in a forgiving mood and executed all the surviving Romans. All told, only a handful of the Romans survived.